Imagine walking into a workplace where people don't just show up to complete tasks, they show up because they feel safe, valued, and trusted. A place where human beings are treated like family, not functions. Where leaders measure success not only by performance metrics, but by the lives they elevate. The truth is this: every single person in your organization carries a story, a fear, a hope, a dream, and they hand it to you the moment they walk through the door. What you choose to do with that responsibility determines whether your culture thrives or collapses. Today, more than ever, companies are losing people not because of salary, workload, or competition, but because they don't feel cared for. And when people don't feel cared for, they stop caring in return. So this is your wake-up call, your leadership siren. If you want an extraordinary organization, start with an extraordinary act of humanity. Treat your people like family. Because when everybody matters, everything changes. Care becomes a strategy the moment we understand that human beings don't commit to leaders. They commit to the environments leaders create. Men, especially, are raised to armor themselves with strength, control, and certainty. Yet underneath that armor is the same fundamental need shared by every human being to feel seen, safe, and significant. When a workplace acknowledges this need, instead of ignoring it, men don't just perform better. They show up with a level of loyalty, clarity, and purpose that no metric can fully capture. Care becomes strategic because men often define their worth through contribution. And when they step into an environment where their contributions are overlooked, dismissed, or taken for granted, something in them begins to shut down. They work, but not wholeheartedly. They show up, but not fully. They comply, but they stop caring. Women see this shutdown happen in their partners, brothers, fathers, and teammates all the time. The silent withdrawal, the buried frustration, the unspoken pressure to handle it alone. When leaders recognize that this emotional retreat comes from a lack of psychological safety, not a lack of motivation, they start to treat care as an organizational lever, not an optional sentiment. Care becomes powerful when women in leadership understand the quiet burdens men carry that they rarely talk about. Many men feel responsible for providing, protecting, and proving themselves, often all at once. They may not articulate the stress directly, but they feel it constantly. When a leader creates an environment where they don't have to pretend, they're unbreakable, they begin to trust. Trust is not a byproduct of authority, it is the outcome of intentional care. And when men trust their leaders, something exceptional happens. They communicate openly, collaborate honestly, and take courageous risks that move the entire organization forward. Care becomes transformative when men begin to understand the emotional intelligence women often bring to teams. Women tend to observe subtle stress signals, withdrawal, irritability, hesitation that men frequently miss in themselves. When women are empowered to bring this insight forward, not as criticism but as awareness, men start to feel supported rather than exposed. That shift alone can alter the entire emotional landscape of a workplace. It allows men to relax the armor, embrace their humanity, and engage with their work in a far more meaningful way. Care becomes a cultural force when everyone realizes that what people need is not sympathy. They need structure, clarity, and consistent signals that they matter. Men respond deeply to environments where expectations are paired with support, where accountability is matched with dignity, and where their effort is recognized without needing to be begged for. Women respond to environments where empathy is matched with action and emotional awareness is considered a strength rather than a liability. When both perspectives work together, care becomes a system rather than a sentiment. Care becomes the competitive edge because it replaces fear with responsibility, pressure with pride, and silence with trust. And when people feel trusted, they no longer show up to survive the day. They show up to build something worth protecting. The safety zone begins the moment people feel they no longer have to look over their shoulder to protect themselves. Men in particular carry a lifetime of conditioning that tells them to stay guarded, to stay in control, and to never reveal uncertainty. When a workplace feels unsafe, emotionally, psychologically, or socially, men default to self-protection. They become cautious with their ideas, selective with their words, and hesitant with their honesty. This isn't weakness, it's instinct. And instinct always overrides talent. When trust is absent, even the most capable men operate at half their potential because the environment signals that exposure is dangerous. The safety zone strengthens when we recognize that women often see the hidden signs of stress that men try to mask. Many women intuitively notice the moments when men pull back, shut down, or become overly serious, not because they lack confidence, but because they lack trust that the environment will support them if they show vulnerability. Women observe these patterns in workplaces, relationships, and families, and they understand that. Men rarely articulate the root cause, they simply retreat. When leaders recognize this retreat not as disengagement, but as self-defense, the need for trust becomes impossible to ignore. The safety zone becomes essential when we understand how men interpret pressure. Men often respond to high expectations by tightening their emotional grip. They push harder, speak less, and try to handle everything alone. But pressure without trust doesn't create excellence, it creates silent burnout. Women see this in their partners and colleagues all the time. The late nights, the short answers, the quiet frustration. And when leaders choose criticism instead of curiosity, when they demand output while ignoring the human being behind it, trust evaporates completely. The result is not just decreased performance, but a culture where people feel they must hide their struggles to survive. The safety zone expands when leaders become the ones who lower the emotional temperature in the room. Men thrive when they know they can express doubt without being judged, ask for help without appearing weak, and admit mistakes without fear of humiliation. Women thrive when emotional intelligence is not dismissed as sensitivity, but valued as insight. When both needs are honored, something remarkable happens. Communication flows freely, and the team begins to operate as a unified organism rather than a collection of guarded individuals. Trust unlocks collaboration because everyone feels protected enough to contribute fully. The safety zone grows stronger when people see consistency, not convenience, in their leaders' behavior. Men respond deeply to leaders who say what they mean and follow through on what they say. Broken promises hit men harder than they admit. They translate inconsistency into instability and instability into risk. Women respond to leaders who acknowledge emotions without weaponizing them, creating a space where honesty is safe instead of costly. Trust is built in these small, repeated signals that say, you're safe here, your voice matters here, and safety is not created by grand gestures. It is created by predictable humanity. The safety zone becomes the birthplace of high performance because trust frees the mind from survival mode. Men think clearer, take wiser risks, and bring forward their best ideas when they are not busy defending themselves. Women connect more deeply, lead more intuitively, and show up more wholly when they know the environment honors emotional truth. And when an entire team no longer has to pretend, hide, or protect themselves, they don't just work better, they become capable of building something far greater than any individual could create alone. Respect is the minimum because it's what people expect, but dignity is the difference because it's what people remember. Men, in particular, move through the world with a deep and often unspoken desire to be valued for who they are, not just what they produce. They've been taught to measure their worth by results, output, and performance, so when they receive only respect, politeness, titles, surface-level acknowledgement, it feels hollow. Respect keeps the peace, but dignity gives a man his sense of place, purpose, and identity, and the moment dignity enters the environment, something inside him comes alive. Dignity becomes essential when we recognize how quietly men carry their insecurities. They may walk with confidence, speak with authority, or act unshaken. Yet underneath that exterior is often a constant internal question. Do I matter here? Respect answers the question of competence, but dignity answers the much deeper question of significance. Women often see this vulnerability long before men speak it. They notice how men react to being dismissed, ignored, or interrupted. They see how deeply men internalize failure or criticism. And when leaders only offer respect without providing dignity, without honoring the human being behind the performance, men don't grow, they harden. Dignity becomes powerful when we understand how men interpret acknowledgement. Men don't need grand praise or constant encouragement. What they crave is validation that their effort has meaning. When a leader publicly respects a man's work but privately treats him as expendable, the disconnect cuts deeply. Women know this dynamic well because they've seen men they care about shut down emotionally when their contributions are minimized. They've watched men withdraw into silence, not because they don't care, but because caring without dignity becomes painful. And the pain builds until disengagement becomes the safest option. Dignity becomes transformative when leaders choose presence over performance. Men thrive when someone looks them in the eye, listens without rushing, and treats their concerns as legitimate rather than inconvenient. Women thrive when their emotional intuition is valued instead of dismissed. In a workplace where dignity is prioritized, both perspectives become strengths. Men feel grounded, and women feel heard. This environment doesn't just improve communication, it elevates the entire culture. It turns meetings into conversations and instructions into shared purpose. Dignity becomes a leadership advantage when we recognize that it shapes how people interpret pressure. Men respond strongly to the tone behind a command. If pressure feels demeaning, they rebel or disconnect. If pressure feels affirming, I trust you with this, they rise. Women respond to whether the environment honors their emotional reality or expects them to ignore it. When leaders infuse dignity into expectations, both men and women step forward with confidence rather than fear. Dignity transforms pressure from a threat into an invitation. Dignity becomes the anchor in relationships, teams, and organizations because it speaks to the core of what every human being needs, to feel valued for their humanity, not just their utility. Men show their best when they don't have to fight for their worth. Women give their best when they know their insight is respected as deeply as their effort. And when dignity becomes the standard, people stop competing for validation and start contributing from a place of genuine belonging. Leadership is service the moment we understand that people don't follow rank. They follow those who make them feel protected and valued. Men especially respond to leaders who stand beside them instead of above them. They have been conditioned to associate leadership with strength, direction, and certainty, yet what they crave most is a leader who actually cares. When a leader uses their position to elevate others rather than elevate themselves, men feel a level of loyalty that cannot be bought or forced. They don't perform out of fear, they perform out of belief. Leadership becomes service when we recognize how deeply men internalize responsibility. Men often feel a pressure to carry the load silently, to prove themselves worthy, and to never show weakness in the process. When leaders treat authority like a privilege rather than a weapon, men finally feel supported instead of judged. Women see this dynamic clearly. They notice how men push themselves past exhaustion, how they hide stress behind silence, how they keep showing up long after they start breaking inside. A leader who serves instead of dominates gives men permission to breathe, to speak, and to ask for help without fear of appearing incapable. Leadership becomes meaningful when women bring their intuition into the environment. Women often understand the emotional temperature of a team long before men do. They sense when morale is slipping, when someone feels overlooked, when pressure is turning into self-doubt, when their insight is honored rather than dismissed. Leadership becomes a two-perspective practice, strength paired with awareness, structure balanced with empathy. Men benefit from this balance because it reveals the emotional realities they were never taught to identify. And women benefit because their intelligence is finally recognized as essential, not optional. Leadership becomes powerful when leaders take responsibility for the well-being of those they lead. Men respond fiercely to leaders who show up for them in moments of uncertainty. A leader who asks, "What do you need?" instead of "Why aren't you delivering?" creates a psychological shift. It tells men they are not expected to carry the world alone. Women respond equally to leaders who acknowledge their unseen emotional labor and validate the weight of what they manage internally. When leaders provide support before demand, people stop defending themselves and start trusting the system around them. Leadership becomes authentic when leaders model the very behavior they hope to inspire. Men follow examples far more than instructions. When a leader demonstrates humility, patience, and accountability, men internalize those traits not because they were told to, but because they witness them. Women respond to leaders who show emotional consistency, who don't weaponize authority, and who create an environment where honesty is safe. When leaders serve through example, culture is formed through imitation rather than enforcement. Leadership becomes transformative when it shifts from command to care. Men flourish when they feel their leader would stand in the fire for them. Women flourish when they feel their leader values not just their contribution, but their presence. When leadership becomes an act of service, people rise, not to impress, but to contribute, not to survive, but to belong. And in that kind of environment, the true power of leadership finally reveals itself, not in the authority it holds, but in the humanity it protects. When people believe they matter, something inside them switches from compliance to commitment. Men, in particular, carry a deep psychological need to feel useful, needed, and significant. They want to know that their presence makes a difference, not just their output. When they sense they matter, they don't just complete tasks. They take ownership. Their performance becomes an expression of their identity, their pride, and their purpose. And the difference between a man who feels needed and a man who feels replaceable is the difference between good work and extraordinary work. When people believe they matter, it reshapes how men interpret responsibility. Men often tie their value to the weight they carry, the problems they solve, and the people who depend on them. If a man feels unimportant, he withdraws. If he feels valued, he leans in. Women see this dynamic clearly. They notice how a man's entire posture changes when he feels trusted, respected, and appreciated. They see how he becomes more patient, more focused, and more open when he believes his role truly matters. And when leaders understand this subtle emotional shift, they begin to treat significance as a performance multiplier, not a sentimental gesture. When people believe they matter, women's intuition becomes an essential part of the culture. Women often recognize emotional cues men overlook: tension, insecurity, frustration, burnout, because they're attuned to relational signals. They understand when someone feels invisible long before that person says a word. When this intuitive awareness is valued, not dismissed, it creates a feedback loop that strengthens the entire team. Men feel supported, women feel heard, and leaders gain insight they would never notice on their own. And that insight becomes the foundation of a culture where individuals don't have to fight for recognition. They receive it as a natural part of their environment. When people believe they matter, performance evolves from doing enough to giving their best. Men especially bring an entirely different level of energy when they know the work is meaningful and their effort is acknowledged. They push harder not because they are pressured, but because they are invested. Women respond with equal intensity when their emotional labor, their thoughtfulness, and their contributions are seen instead of assumed. They bring clarity, cohesion, and intuition into the work in ways that elevate everyone, meaning transforms work into something people take personally in the best way possible. When people believe they matter, they begin to speak up with a level of honesty that transforms the team. Men become more willing to share their ideas, admit mistakes, and ask for help when they trust that their voice carries weight. Women become more willing to communicate openly when they know their insights won't be minimized or overlooked. This honesty eliminates the silent friction that destroys performance and replaces it with collaboration rooted in trust. The environment becomes one where people feel safe enough to give their truth, not just their labor. When people believe they matter, their performance reflects their pride rather than their fear. Men no longer protect their ego, they protect their contribution. Women no longer hide their intelligence, they bring it forward. And when leaders create a culture where every person feels seen, valued, and essential, performance becomes far more than a metric. It becomes a personal mission to honor the trust that has been placed in them. The family standard begins with the simple truth that people thrive where they feel they belong. Men, especially, respond to environments where loyalty, protection, and trust are not just spoken but demonstrated. They carry an instinctive drive to provide and to be part of something worth protecting. When a workplace mirrors the emotional safety of a healthy family, where people look out for each other instead of competing against each other, men lean in with a different level of commitment. They don't work from fear of consequences. They work from pride in the community they are part of. The family standard takes root when we recognize that pressure alone does not build strong cultures. Love does. Men often endure pressure silently. They internalize stress, suppress emotion, and tell themselves to push through because that is what society taught them strength looks like. Women see the emotional cost this creates. They observe how pressure hardens men, makes them distant, or turns them into versions of themselves they don't want to be. When leaders replace fear-driven urgency with genuine care, men feel permission to show their true selves instead of their guarded selves. And when men feel safe enough to be real, their contribution becomes far more powerful. The family standard gains strength when we understand that love and leadership is not softness, It's responsibility. Men respond deeply to leaders who honor commitments, protect their teams, and stand up for them when things go wrong. This mirrors the protective nature men feel in their own families. Women respond to leaders who value empathy, communication, and emotional intelligence, the qualities that often hold real families together. When both masculine and feminine strengths shape the culture, love becomes structural, not sentimental. It becomes the backbone of how decisions are made, how conflict is handled, and how people are treated in moments that matter. The family standard shows its power when people realize that belonging creates performance that pressure never can. Men give more when they feel like part of the tribe. They push harder when they believe the team depends on them, not because they're afraid of failing, but because they want to contribute to something meaningful. Women bring depth, intuition, and stability when the culture values their emotional insight rather than dismissing it as unnecessary. When leaders cultivate belonging, people stop performing for approval and start performing out of genuine loyalty to each other. The family standard becomes real when leaders create emotional rhythms similar to those found in the strongest families: consistency, honesty, and care. Men thrive in environments where they know the rules won't change based on mood or hierarchy. They need stability to feel grounded. Women thrive when emotional cues are acknowledged, when communication flows openly, and when relationships are treated as part of the work rather than a distraction from it. These rhythms build cultures where people don't brace themselves at work. They relax into trust. The family standard transforms the workplace when people stop seeing each other as roles and start seeing each other as human beings. Men feel valued not only for what they achieve, but for who they are beneath the armor they wear. Women feel respected not only for their output, but for the emotional clarity and resilience they bring. And when the culture operates like a family, steady, supportive, and unified, people don't rise from pressure, they rise from love.